Picture the logo, the red chevron, the white pack, the cowboy on the horizon with his collar up against the wind. For most of the 20th century, that image meant rugged independence, a man, a horse, an open sky, and nothing between him and the life he wanted. You'd assume a brand that sold that feeling for 70 years got there by understanding something true about freedom. However, the real story is a lot more unsettling than a cowboy on a horse. And it starts somewhere the brand's own marketing has spent 70 years making sure you'd never think to look. Because Marlboro didn't start as a symbol of masculinity at all. It started as a cigarette for women. And the transformation from that to the best-selling tobacco brand on earth involved a marketing campaign so effective and a cover-up so deliberate that people are still dying from the consequences of both, decades after most of the men who built it are gone. So how did a lipstick-stained women's cigarette from the 1920s become the most recognized brand in the history of advertising? To understand that, you have to go back to a tobacco shop on Bond Street, London, in 1847. That's where Philip Morris, a young British tobacconist, opened his first store, hand-rolling cigarettes for a genteel clientele who still mostly smoked pipes and cigars. It was a modest operation by design, quality tobacco, sold by weight, blended to order for regulars who came back week after week because the man behind the counter knew their taste. Philip Morris himself would die in 1873, relatively young, and the business passed to his family, who expanded it into a proper factory on Great Marlborough Street, turning a single shop into a real manufacturing concern that could supply retailers across London. That street name would end up being the whole reason the brand exists as we know it. When Philip Morris and Company later needed a name for a new, upscale cigarette line aimed at the American market, they reached for the address instead of a person, betting that something that sounded aristocratic and English would carry more weight with wealthier American buyers than a founder's surname ever could. In 1924, the American arm of Philip Morris launched Marlboro as a filtered cigarette blended with mild Turkish tobacco, aimed squarely at women. This was a genuinely clever read of the market. Filters were marketed as a way to avoid the appearance of tobacco stains, and the filter itself was tinted ivory, or sometimes red, specifically to hide lipstick marks. The slogan was "Mild as May." The advertising showed elegant women in evening dress, cigarette held at a careful angle. The whole scene lit like a perfume ad. It was a small, respectable, forgettable little brand for 3 decades, a niche product competing against dozens of other regional labels in a crowded market. Nobody smoked it to feel powerful. They smoked it to feel refined, and for a company still finding its footing in American retail, refined was a perfectly reasonable place to start. And for 30 years, that's all it ever was. A modest seller, profitable enough to keep on the shelf, never once threatening to become the biggest cigarette brand in the country, let alone the world. Which is what makes what happened next so strange. Because the company that would eventually build the most successful masculine brand identity in advertising history spent its first 3 decades explicitly avoiding that identity altogether. Marlboro wasn't reinvented because someone had a bold vision. It was reinvented because of a public health scare, and the response to that scare is where this story actually begins to turn. By the early 1950s, Philip Morris had a real business problem. Scientific research linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer was starting to reach the public, most notably through a 1952 Reader's Digest article called "Cancer by the Carton," which caused the first sustained drop in US cigarette sales since the Great Depression. The industry's answer was the filter, marketed implicitly as a safer cigarette. Philip Morris repositioned Marlboro to chase this new filter market in 1954. There was just one problem. filtered cigarettes, Marlboro included, were still seen as a woman's product, and that was never going to work if the company wanted the volume the filter category promised. This is where Leo Burnett, the advertising executive Philip Morris brought in, made the decision that would define the brand forever. Burnett's insight wasn't really about tobacco at all. It was about psychology. He reasoned that any advertising campaign that tried to reassure smokers filters were safe would only remind them to be afraid, planting the exact worry it was trying to erase. So he did the opposite. He stripped out every reference to health, safety, or reassurance, and replaced it with pure, unshakable masculine imagery. Sea captains, weightlifters, war correspondents, ranch hands. The agency tested each of them on real audiences, looking for the figure people responded to without hesitation, the one that needed no explanation at all. Of all of them, one image tested best and simply never left: the cowboy. The first cowboy ads ran in 1954, scored to a version of what would become Elmer Bernstein's theme from The Magnificent Seven, and the industrial designer Frank Gianinotto gave the cigarette itself a new red and white flip-top box, the first of its kind, engineered to feel substantial in a man's hand, to click shut with a satisfying, almost mechanical sound. Every detail, from the typeface to the shape of the chevron, was built to communicate strength before a single word of copy was read. The effect was almost immediate. Before the campaign, Marlboro was selling around 18 million cigarettes a year, a rounding error in the industry barely worth mentioning in an annual report. Within a year, that number was 6 billion. By 1957, it was 20 billion. Within 3 years, this quiet women's brand had become one of the fastest growing products in American retail history, built entirely on an image that had nothing to do with the product inside the box. By 1972, Marlboro was the best-selling cigarette on the planet, a title it would hold for decades, outselling brands that had been market leaders for generations before the cowboy ever showed up. Give the strategy its due, Leo Burnett had identified something genuinely true about how people relate to brands. Nobody buys a product, they buy an idea of themselves. The Marlboro Man wasn't selling tobacco. He was selling a version of American freedom so complete that people would pay to breathe it in, literally. As pure marketing craft, it's one of the most effective campaigns ever created. It deserves to be studied, and it is in business schools to this day, held up as proof that the right image can outsell the actual contents of a product by a factor of 1,000 to 1. However, and this is where the story stops being a triumph, the same year Leo Burnett was reinventing Marlboro's image, the American tobacco industry was making a very different decision behind closed doors, and it's impossible to separate the two. On January 4, 1954, the same year the cowboy first rode across American magazine pages, the chief executives of every major U.S. tobacco company, Philip Morris among them, published a full-page ad in more than 400 newspapers, reaching an estimated 43 million readers. It was called A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. Drafted with the help of the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton, it questioned the emerging science linking smoking to cancer, promised smokers their health came first, and announced a new joint research body, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, that would get to the bottom of things once and for all. It sounded reassuring. Newspaper readers in early 1954 could be forgiven for taking real comfort from it, a joint pledge signed by every major manufacturer that public health came before profit. It was, according to internal documents that would surface decades later, a calculated act of misdirection. The committee wasn't built to find the truth. It was built to manufacture doubt about a truth the industry's own scientists were already beginning to confirm. And it worked exactly as designed for for far longer than anyone outside the industry understood at the time. For years afterward, whenever a new study linking smoking to disease made headlines, a spokesman for the industry's research committee would appear in the same news cycle, noting that the science remained unsettled or that further study was needed. A phrase repeated so often across so many decades that public health historians would later treat it as the industry's signature rhetorical move. One internal tobacco industry memo, later entered into evidence in federal court, put the strategy more plainly than any advertisement ever would. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. That sentence, not the cowboy, not the cancer, just that one internal memo, is the real hinge of this entire story. Everything that followed, every scandal, every lawsuit, every death that came after, traces back to a company deciding, in the same year it built the most beloved brand image in American history, that the truth was a problem to be managed rather than a fact to be disclosed. And once that door was open, it wouldn't close again. For the next 4 decades, Philip Morris and its industry peers ran what internal company documents, later surfaced through litigation, describe as a coordinated effort to discredit independent cancer research, fund friendly scientists, and keep the public uncertain about a danger the company's own labs had already quietly confirmed. Internal Philip Morris research from as early as the 1950s and the 1960s acknowledged nicotine's addictive properties and tobacco smoke's carcinogenic effects. The very findings the company's public statements spent the same decades disputing. Company scientists working in labs the public never saw understood the biology roughly as well as anyone in independent academia did. What they did with that understanding wasn't publish it, it was file it and keep selling. That gap between what the company knew internally and what it told the public is the first crack in the Marlboro story, and it would only widen from here. We're only just getting started. The most human cost of Marlboro's success wore the very image the company built to sell it. Beginning in the 1950s and running for decades, the men Philip Morris and its advertising partners hired to embody the Marlboro Man, actual cowboys, actual ranch hands, actual working men, chosen because they looked authentic on camera, smoked the product they were paid to advertise, often heavily, often because the job asked them to be photographed with a cigarette between their fingers for years at a stretch. Several of them died of the exact diseases their own advertisements had spent decades implying didn't exist. Wayne McLaren, a former professional rodeo rider who modeled for Marlboro print campaigns in the mid-1970s, died of lung cancer in 1992. He was 51. In his final months, he became an outspoken anti-smoking advocate, appearing before Congress and in television interviews specifically to warn people away from the product he'd once been paid to sell, telling one interviewer that he wanted young people to know the Marlboro Man was a fake. David McLean, who appeared in Marlboro television and print ads through the 1960s, died of lung cancer in 1995. His widow and son later filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Philip Morris, arguing that McLean's nicotine addiction, developed through decades of smoking the brand he advertised, made it impossible for him to quit. David Miller, another Marlboro man, died of emphysema in 1987. Eric Lawson, who appeared in the campaign from 1978 to 1981, died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in 2014 at 72. 4 men, chosen because they were the most convincing embodiment of health and vitality the company's agency could find, dead of the 4 diseases most reliably linked to the product they were paid to hold. None of them were told anything the public wasn't also being told at the time. That's precisely the point. To be fair, no one forced these men to smoke, and Philip Morris has never denied that adult smokers understood cigarettes carried risk. The Surgeon General's warning had been printed on every pack since 1966. Millions of people made an informed choice to smoke and lived long lives regardless. And it would be dishonest to pretend every smoker who ever picked up a Marlboro was somehow tricked into it against their will. But that framing only holds up if the public genuinely had the full picture. And for decades, the same company photographing these men for its advertisements was privately funding research designed to keep that picture blurry, disputing in public exactly what its own scientists had already quietly confirmed. The men who sold the myth were, in the most literal sense possible, consumed by it. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Because while the company's own advertising faces were dying of the product, internal Philip Morris marketing documents from later litigation revealed a strategy specifically built around a different vulnerable group: teenagers. Company research, some of it uncovered during state lawsuits in the 1990s, examined smoking initiation patterns in adolescents and discussed the importance of capturing what internal documents called replacement smokers, the next generation of customers needed to offset the older smokers who quit or, more bluntly, died. A 1975 internal Philip Morris research memo explicitly analyzed the youngest legal smokers as a critical segment for long-term brand growth, since brand loyalty, once formed in the teenage years, tended to last a lifetime. This wasn't unique to Philip Morris. It was industry-wide practice, but Marlboro, as the dominant brand, benefited the most from it. Youth smoking rates climbed through the 1980s and the 1990s, and Marlboro consistently ranked as the single most popular brand among underage smokers in national surveys, more popular among teenagers than among the college-educated adult men the cowboy imagery ostensibly targeted. Public health researchers who studied the pattern found something quietly damning in it. A cigarette explicitly built around adult masculine imagery was, by a wide margin, the brand teenagers reached for first, which suggested the appeal was never really about the age on the label at all. The company would later insist publicly that it never intended to market to minors. But the paper trail told a different story, and eventually, that paper trail ended up in federal court. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because underneath the marketing, there was chemistry. Internal Philip Morris documents, later surfaced in litigation and academic review, showed that company researchers understood as far back as the 1970s that adding ammonia compounds to tobacco raised its pH, converting a portion of the nicotine into a freebase form that the human body absorbs faster and more completely. In practical terms, this meant a cigarette could be engineered to deliver a sharper, more satisfying hit of nicotine to the brain, without necessarily increasing the tar and nicotine numbers that showed up on government-mandated testing machines. This chemistry became especially important for the light and low-tar cigarettes the industry began rolling out in the 1970s and 1980s, marketed as a gentler alternative for health-conscious smokers who wanted to cut back rather than quit. It would take another 2 decades before that particular piece of engineering became a lawsuit in its own right, but the foundation for it was being laid in a research lab, while the public still believed lights were simply weaker. And that lawsuit came. Beginning in the mid-1990s, smokers in state after state filed class actions alleging that Marlboro Lights and Marlboro Ultra Lights had been marketed as measurably safer, lower in tar and nicotine, when the company's own internal testing showed that smokers naturally compensated for the weaker cigarette by taking longer, deeper drags, or by covering the tiny ventilation holes in the filter with their fingers or lips without realizing it. Habits that could deliver just as much tar and nicotine as a regular Marlboro Red. A Massachusetts court found that Philip Morris had falsely advertised the health benefits of its light cigarettes and ordered payments to nearly 200,000 smokers. An Arkansas case, running for 13 years, ended in a $45 million settlement. A separate nationwide class action alleging false advertising over Marlboro Light's nicotine levels sought more than $600 million in damages before reaching the courts. The word light itself was eventually banned from cigarette packaging altogether under a 2009 federal law, precisely because regulators concluded the term had misled smokers into believing a demonstrably false thing for over 30 years. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because the government eventually built a case around exactly the paper trail behind the youth targeting and the light's deception both. In September 1999, the United States Department of Justice sued Philip Morris and the other major tobacco companies under federal racketeering law, the same statute originally designed to prosecute organized crime bosses, not cigarette executives in tailored suits. The case, United States versus Philip Morris, took years to litigate, working through mountains of internal memos, meeting minutes, and research files the companies had spent decades trying to keep sealed. In August 2006, Judge Gladys Kessler issued her ruling, a 1,683-page opinion, finding that the tobacco companies had violated RICO through a decades-long scheme to defraud the American public about the health risks and addictiveness of smoking. Her opinion stated plainly that the companies had suppressed and concealed scientific research, destroyed internal documents, and coordinated a public relations and marketing effort specifically designed to keep young people smoking, all while denying in public that any such targeting occurred. Reading her findings today, decades of denial compress into a single sentence. The companies knew and said otherwise on purpose, for money. The ruling was upheld on appeal in 2009. As part of the remedy, the courts eventually ordered Philip Morris and the other companies to publish court-mandated corrective statements, full-page and broadcast admissions, in the company's own words, acknowledging that smoking kills more Americans than murder, AIDS, alcohol, drugs, car crashes, and fires combined, and that the companies had lied about it for decades. Those statements didn't start appearing until 2017, more than a decade after the ruling, and more than 60 years after the Frank statement first tried to bury the same truth. And it wasn't only the people who chose to smoke who paid a price. Through the 1980s and the 1990s, evidence mounted that secondhand smoke, the exhaled and sidestream smoke that fills a room whether or not everyone in it is holding a cigarette, carried real cardiovascular and cancer risk of its own. Nowhere was that clearer than 30,000 feet in the air. In October 1991, a group of flight attendants led by Norma Broyne filed a class action against Philip Morris and the other major manufacturers, arguing that decades of forced exposure to cigarette smoke in sealed airplane cabins, smoke their employers required them to work inside of for entire careers, had caused cancers, respiratory disease, and heart conditions among people who had never smoked a cigarette in their lives. The case settled in 1997 for $300 million, earmarked for research into exactly the kinds of disease the attendants said they'd developed, while individual flight attendants were free to sue the companies directly for their own specific injuries. Philip Morris never smoked anyone's cigarette for them, but for years, its own products had been filling the recycled air of pressurized cabins that flight attendants could not leave and were not allowed to refuse to work in. A version of harm the company had never advertised, never tested for on a smoker's behalf, and never had to answer for until the people breathing it sued. By then, the financial reckoning had already arrived in a different form. In November 1998, Philip Morris and the other major tobacco companies signed the Master Settlement Agreement with 46 state attorneys general, agreeing to pay at least $206 billion over 25 years to cover the public health costs of treating sick smokers, to disband the industry's shared research and lobbying front groups, and to release millions of pages of previously secret internal documents. The same documents historians and litigators would spend the next 20 years combing through to reconstruct exactly how much the industry had known and exactly when. It remains one of the largest civil settlements in American legal history, larger than the GDP of many of the countries Marlboro was, by then, actively expanding into. And still, it was framed less as an admission of guilt than as the cost of making a very large, very persistent problem go away. A settlement negotiated by lawyers, paid out over decades in installments, the companies could comfortably absorb against continuing cigarette sales, rather than a moment where anyone in a position of power stood up and said, on the record, that they were sorry. None of this stayed confined to the United States. As American regulations tightened through the 1990s and the 2000s, banning cigarette advertising on television, restricting sponsorships, eventually barring the Marlboro Man himself from domestic airwaves entirely in 1999, Philip Morris's international arm simply took the same playbook overseas, to markets with far less regulatory scrutiny and, in many cases, far less public awareness of the American litigation that had already established the facts. In the 2010s, the company's Be Marlboro campaign ran in more than 50 countries, built around music festivals, youth-coded imagery, and social media contests that asked young people to submit photos and videos for a chance to be featured in the brand's advertising. It was banned in Germany after a court found it targeted teenagers. Brazilian regulators fined the company several $100,000 for the same reason. Similar complaints followed in several other countries, where consumer protection agencies concluded the campaign's imagery, bright colors, crowds of visibly young people, festival settings with almost no adults in frame, was never really designed with adult smokers in mind at all. The specific tactics changed continent to continent. The underlying logic, find the next generation of smokers before they're old enough to legally buy the product, then let brand loyalty do the rest, traced in an unbroken line back to that 1975 internal memo about replacement smokers. This was just the first of many countries where the same fight would repeat, one regulatory body at a time, decades apart from the last one, each new market discovering on its own timeline what American courts had already spent a decade proving. Zoom out, and the number waiting at the end of all of it is almost too large to process as anything other than an abstraction. Tobacco use kills more than 8 million people every year worldwide. According to the World Health Organization, over 7 million of them direct users, and more than 1 million more from secondhand smoke exposure among people who never chose to smoke at all. In the last 30 years alone, more than 200 million people have died from smoking-related disease. If current patterns hold, epidemiologists project roughly 1 billion tobacco deaths globally across this century, a number roughly equal to the combined populations of the United States and Europe, gone, one preventable disease at a time, over the span of 100 years. Marlboro didn't cause all of that alone, but as the single best-selling cigarette brand on Earth for most of the period these numbers describe, consistently the market leader through the exact decades when global smoking rates climbed highest, it carries a share of that total that no advertising campaign, however brilliant, was ever built to reckon with. Put another way, more people have died because of the brand built around an image of vigorous good health than most wars managed to kill in a single decade. And it happened quietly enough, spread out widely enough that most of the people smoking a Marlboro today have never once connected the two facts in their own head. So to be fair, one more time, Philip Morris, now operating under the parent company Altria and its international counterpart, Philip Morris International, no longer deny any of this history. In recent years, both companies have rebranded themselves publicly as harm reduction companies, investing heavily in reduced-risk products like heated tobacco and nicotine pouches, and stating outright in their own annual reports that the best way to avoid the harms of smoking is never to start at all. In 2000, Philip Morris became the first major tobacco company to publicly admit, in its own words, that smoking causes disease and that nicotine is addictive, an admission that arrived only after the master settlement, only after the RICO suit had already been filed, and only after decades of internal research had already reached the same conclusion in private. Altria's stated 2030 vision describes responsibly leading the transition of adult smokers to a smoke-free future, and company representatives point to falling US smoking rates and billions of dollars redirected into vapor and nicotine pouch products as evidence the pivot is real. Public health researchers remain divided on how much credit that deserves. Some point out that a genuinely reformed company wouldn't still be marketing combustible cigarettes under the Marlboro name in dozens of countries where regulation is thinner than it is in the United States. Others argue that a company changing direction at all after 100 years of the alternative is worth acknowledging rather than dismissing outright. Whether Altria's current posture is a genuine reckoning with the company's own history, or simply the next chapter of the same instinct that produced the frank statement in 1954. Find the version of the truth that keeps the business alive, and say it with just enough sincerity to be believed, is a question the company's critics and public health researchers are still actively arguing about, and one this video isn't going to settle for you. So, Marlboro built one of the most successful, most studied, most genuinely brilliant brand identities in the history of advertising. That part is true. Leo Burnett's Cowboy remains a case study in nearly every marketing curriculum on Earth, and the transformation from a forgotten women's cigarette to the best-selling tobacco product on the planet is, by any commercial measure, a real and remarkable achievement. Nobody can take that away from it. But the same year that image was born, the company helped write the first page of a decades-long campaign to keep the public in the dark about what that image was selling. The men who modeled the myth died from the product they modeled. The teenagers the company always denied targeting became, by its own internal numbers, its most loyal future customers. Smokers who switched to a lighter pack for their health absorbed nearly the same dose without ever being told their own habits had been quietly priced into the marketing from the start. Flight attendants who never lit a cigarette in their lives inhaled it anyway, for entire careers, because refusing wasn't part of the job description. And the company that once ran a full-page ad promising smokers their health came first, spent the next 60 years being ordered, court case by court case, settlement by settlement, to admit, in its own words, on television in its own name, that none of that had been true. Does the brilliance of the marketing excuse the deliberate decades of doubt sold alongside it? Does an eventual admission, extracted by federal courts and 46 state attorneys general rather than offered freely, count as accountability at all? Is a company that spends the present trying to lead smokers away from its own founding product still the same company that spent a century doing everything it could to keep them smoking it? That's not a question with a clean answer, and maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe the discomfort of not having a tidy verdict is the most honest place a story like this can end. Picture the logo one more time: the red chevron, the white pack, the cowboy on the horizon. collar up against the wind, riding towards something that always looks like freedom from a distance. Nobody ever tells you what he's riding away from.